welcome to this session. And I always want to thank Russ and Tracy for signing for us, and and Abdul and Sam, and the marathon nature of the signing over these 5 days. We're going to be talking about ecocide, and actually the coining of the word, the meaning of the word, and the actions around the word. And I've got 4 incredible speakers, 2 here and 2 there. They'll appear shortly. And I just wanted to give a little background to my own experience of something here, which is that as a theatre director, I became a great friend of the writer Wole Soyinka. And at one point, he was going to be directing a play of his called Beatification of Area Boy, which dealt with a number of things, one of which was the Ogoni people and their fight with the oil companies and the devastation of their homes and their right to survival. But it turned out that he couldn't do this play in Nigeria in the end because he became a wanted man. So in Abacha, obviously, made it impossible, and he was under death threat. He asked me, kind of amazingly, to go into Nigeria in secret and audition actors and smuggle them back to the UK to do the production in the UK, which I did. And while I was directing the play and we were in rehearsal, we had a Nigerian Secret Service wandering around all the time in the foyer, pretending not to be there, spying on the actors for having come to do this play. Wole was around the world trying to persuade governments to prevent the hanging of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his compatriots. So on the day that we opened the show in Yorkshire, at the West Yorkshire Playhouse, where I was the artistic director at the time, they were hung. And then we took the play all over the world, and we had many, many people, but enormous number of Nigerians of every background and from everywhere coming to the play, really as a kind of a homage to Ken Saro-Wiwa and all of his compatriots, and to Wole, of course, as well. And it was one of those very privileged and painful moments when art is the thing that's needed, because it told the story. The story was full of laughter and fun and music. It wasn't all desperate, but at the centre of it was this terrible corruption. And then Wole, who all by that time was a poet laureate and and a world figure, and everybody always asked him to come to every conference in the world, etc., etc. But even he, Wole, could not prevent the hanging. He couldn't get anyone to intervene. And so from then on, his son and his daughter became people who I was sort of involved with in terms of other moments of protest. So I've sort of watched as companies that were near and, in fact, deeply involved in all of that found a way of distancing themselves. And I just thought that was the nearest I've got in my own lifetime to seeing something where truly innocent activists were destroyed reputationally and then actually in order to cover up and maintain a practice which now has become so much more exposed. So it's a kind of privilege to be sitting with people who are still directly involved in some of these issues of both corruption and change that we need to talk about. So to introduce the group that we've got, Nnimmo Bassey, who will appear on our screen in a second, I hope. Yes, hello, Nnimmo. Is an architect, a poet, and an author. He's the director of the ecological think tank Health of Mother Earth Foundation. He's a member of the steering committee of Oil Watch International, and he was chair of Friends of the Earth International between 2008 and 2012. And next to him on the screen is Philippe Sands. He's a professor of public understanding of law at the University College London and the Samuel and Judith Weiser visiting professor of law at Harvard Law School. He's president of English Pen, and on the board of the Hay Festival of Arts and Literature. And as you know, the other day we had the anniversary of the 100th anniversary of English Pen, and Elif Shafak gave a lecture here, and it was fantastic. Karen McCarthy Woolf was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to join the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA as poet in residence, where she explores law, poetry, and ecologies of space. And her latest collection, Seasonal Disturbances, was a winner in the inaugural Laurel Prize for Ecological Poetry. She's one of the 30 poets that our laureate Simon Armitage chose to speak to the 30 rights in the Declaration. And we've had 10 poets per night doing their readings. She was last night, which was fantastic. And if you've nothing else to do tonight and you haven't already booked, or even if you have got something else to do, you can cancel it. Come to the finale where we do the last 10 rights. And then Jojo Mehta, who is co-founder of Stop Ecocide. She co-founded it in 2017 alongside, she's a barrister and legal pioneer with the late Polly Higgins. Together they've created this organisation to support the establishment of ecocide as a crime at the International Criminal Court. She's chair of the charitable Stop Ecocide Foundation. So we've got a heavyweight group, and it's a heavyweight subject. And let me come to you, Nnimmo. And you know, we'd like to hear from you about the impact of climate change on the communities in Nigeria, and how it's changed over the recent years, and I suppose how to build the bridges between us and the communities that are dealing with climate change, and make sure that it's not just rhetoric, but it's actual action. So perhaps you could give us a landscape view.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be a part of Ripples of Hope Festival. And it's really something for communities and peoples who are the front line impacted by global warming, impacted by extractivist activities at the supply end of the pipeline. And really, although the people are so impacted, the people are also the source of hope that we can have a much saner future. Let me begin by saying that the whole attack on Mother Earth, the attack on our environment, has systemic roots, and is a root of exploitation that allows anything for profit, that disregards our ecosystem, disregards Mother Earth, disregards fellow humans and other beings. And so it's not a surprise to both those who are instigating this harm and those who are suffering the harm, that we are now at the brink of cataclysmic climate change. All the reports we are hearing are showing that we are in real trouble, and recognizing ecocide as a crime is one sure way to stem the tide. Now, if you come to the supply end of the pipeline, where I come from, where the problems are building up on a daily basis, oil has been extracted in Nigeria in commercial quantities since 1958. The first commercial oil well was sunk in 1956. From 1958, the extraction and pollution started. So we're talking about accumulated pollution over a period of 63 years at the least. And it is not just an occasional drop of oil. One drop of oil contaminates 25 liters of water. So when you think of hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude oil, millions of barrels dropped into the creeks, streams, estuaries, and the shorelines of the Atlantic Ocean in Nigeria, in the Gulf of Guinea, we're talking about massive ecocide. And the climate impacts are enormous also. But first, let me talk about the impacts. The way the environment is damaged. You mentioned Kensarawiwa and Ogoni. The Ogoni environment is one that has been assessed by United Nations Environment Program, and so we have documented evidence about the harm. And the report that was issued in 2011 showed that the entire area is, the water in the entire area is contaminated, groundwater and surface water, which means the first aquifer where that the first water aquifer that the local people can reach when they drill boreholes to get drinking water is already contaminated. And you can't get clean water at that level. So people are forced to drink water laced with hydrocarbons, water laced with benzene, which is a known carcinogen. And so on a daily basis, people are drinking toxic water. People are breathing, inhaling air that is laced with hydrocarbon vapors. And of course, the soil itself is contaminated. The UNEP report showed that soils were, as at 2011, were contaminated to a depth of 5 meters. And as at last year, when some of those locations were cleaned up, the pollution had gone as deep as 10 meters. No wonder King Saro-Wiwa was such a prophet, against this kind of degradation. And in one of his last writings, the last poems before he was killed, he wrote a poem called Silence Would Be Treason. And gladly, I would say that you're going to be silent, neither of the people will be in the oil fields or they've been exposed to. We have now the Nigerian body, the authorities, the National Oil Spill Detection and Response Agency, counted the oil spills between 2018 and 2019, and there were a total of 1,300 oil spills, averaging 5 oil spills every single day. Now, it's crazy to think about it, but as we speak right now, there's an oil spill going on somewhere, and one is at an oil well called Ororo 1, which blew up in April 2020. As we speak, there's still a fire going on offshore at that well, and oil spill is still going on. This ecocide in real time, and nothing is being done to stop it. And so we have, apart from the oil spills, we're having pipelines that have fragmented the ecosystem, destroyed mangrove forests and high-rain forests, and we have a total of 5,000 kilometers length of pipelines crisscrossing the Niger Delta. So the depth of pollution, the depth of destruction of livelihoods is enormous. The fish that people manage to catch is this poisonous, toxic fish. Not healthy, but people have to eat that fish because the alternative is to eat imported fish. And sad to say, the majority of the people living on the coastline in Nigeria depend on imported fish. But fishing ought to be their lifestyle, not for commercial, but as a means, as just something they love to do as part of their life. Farming is a part of their life, but now neither farming nor fishing yields anything that is healthy for their consumption. The other thing I would mention before I pause is gas flaring. As oil is being extracted, there's gas associated with that oil extraction. And some of this have been burning. The oil companies, rather than harnessing the gas for domestic or industrial use, or re-injected the gas into the oil wells, simply light the fires. And so you have giant toxic furnaces burning 24 hours a day. Now, to imagine that you can have such a crime committed in broad daylight, 24 hours a day for up to 60 years, and then they still go on doing that is simply mind-boggling. Now, that act was outlawed. There was a law drawn up in Nigeria in 1984, but the act has not stopped because whenever, as they burn the gas, they are just going to pay a tiny fine, which is a fraction, insignificant fraction of the commercial value of the gas. And so they have no incentive at all to stop. And Nigeria just made a new Petroleum Industry Act, which doesn't stop that act of gas flaring or even oil spills. And so I don't know it's mind-blowing. What I would like to say to conclude is that what gives me joy, what gives me strength, is that the people are resolute, demanding that this nonsense has to stop. And they've done this by direct action, occupying the oil platforms, occupying the fields. They've done this by marching on the street. They've done it by litigation. And of recent, we've got some significant judgments in courts in Europe, in Netherlands, in the UK, against Shell, for example. Shell was asked to compensate 3 farmers by the judgment of the appeal court at The Hague. And the Supreme Court in the UK ruled that the actions of Shell's subsidiary in Nigeria can be challenged in the courts in the UK. And just about a month ago, Shell agreed that they would compensate the community for an oil spill that occurred in 1970. Now, this oil spill occurred 50 years ago, and there's been litigation for over a period of 30 years on that. And they're quite interferent, but now they finally come down to agree that they're going to compensate the community, which shows that there's been a consistent period of denial, of placing the burden on blaming the victims, and the victims have not kept quiet. They've not been silent. They've been struggling, and we like to see global solidarity to stand with these poor people who are fighting the impacts of destructive extraction and who are tackling global warming by direct action. And I mentioned Ogoni. The Ogoni have kept the oil in the ground since 1993, and that to me is a signal way to tackle global warming.
So I know that the internet was a little unstable at times, but I mean that is a devastating, apocalyptic picture of fires and poisoning and wholesale destruction of livelihoods and the ability to eat proper fish and the ability to drink proper water. Can you just say, Nnimmo, how many people are the Ogoni people?
Well, the Ogoni is a small fraction of the Niger Delta. By the early 90s, there were 500,000 people. Now they are about just slightly above 1 million people. Yeah. For the entire Niger Delta, we're talking about 40 million people plus, whose livelihoods, whose environment, whose cultures have been degraded because the environment is the basis of their life.
Okay, so 40 million people degraded in terms of their lives by this. Let's just sit on that information for a minute, so the picture of that and the imagery of it, and how long it's gone on for, and how many denials have been, how much obfuscation and avoidance and collusion between governments and corporations in order to maintain all of this, and blaming of the activists. And while we're just sitting on that information, I'm going to come to Karen, because I'll come back on the sort of what this means in other ways. But what was it that prompted you, Karen, to become not to become a poet, but to turn your attention to become a poet of ecological poetry?
I think really it's based around the idea that, as a poet, you're kind of constantly responding to your environment, what surrounds you, what is ambient, what is intense, and also as a writer, you are always connected to conflict, and you're thinking about, kind of all of those things that test you. I mean, there's been a long tradition in, sort of British poetry. If you think of the Romantics, and you think about writing about nature, but at the same time, how can I write about nature with everything that's happening to it? And even when we think about nature as a concept, this idea that nature is over there and we humans are here, I mean, that's just nonsensical, really. And so I guess it's kind of, that's been, I've always felt like, we've got to have a planet in which to have our problems, humanity, and hopefully we won't have them. So in a way, it's always been the thing that's made perfect sense to me, that the work connects at that level.
And were you aware of Ken Saro-Wiwa as a poet?
Yeah.
Separate from him as an activist, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I think that, even if we think, and a lot of the time, I think, sometimes you might sort of think, sort of Wordsworth, or John Clare, or people that have, kind of celebrated what exists in the natural world. At the same time, they were writing, at a time of industrial revolution, at the beginning of this great kind of, at the beginning of the great capitalist experiment, which, as we're seeing, isn't really working out that well. So they were writing at the beginning of that, and they were writing poetry of protest in its way. And I think, I mean, I also think that we can kind of get a little bit, what's the word? We can become a little bit sort of set in our idea of what an eco-poem is. But actually, you know, if you're writing about, you know, if you're writing about a journey here from Sudan, and actually you've had to move from Sudan because you're essentially a climate refugee, but you might not be being called that, but that may be the reason why that conflict has uprooted you and your family, and why you've made that journey. And so there are lots of kind of spaces in which we have, you know, there's a lot of different ways and different disruptors that we've been seeing happening for a long time. But I think now that we're, you know, kind of faced with such a global crisis. I mean, it's interesting just thinking about water and thinking about legislation as well, because I sort of write a lot about water and being on water. But, you know, I was just reading the other day that now that we don't have the sort of European law in place, they've just given the water authorities the go-ahead to put raw sewage into the rivers here in the UK, because they cannot get the sewage treatment chemicals from the EU. So, you know, that's how kind of, you know, you end up with these, you know, kind of, we're all facing these issues at sort of different levels.
Yeah, they're all absolutely connected.
Yeah.
So it would be wonderful if you could read your poem that you wrote as part of the declaration. I say that now because, you know, we can't have Ken Saro-Wiwa here. And in a way, I think it's a good honour. I don't think that this story, when it was originally sort of came to our attention, I think if it hadn't been for Ken Saro-Wiwa's fame as a writer, and Wole Soyinka's fame as a writer, we wouldn't have known about it in quite the same way. I think that it was a pity that he became only known really as a poet activist, because he was a poet in all sorts of lyrical ways. And I'm sure, you know, you're not just an ecological poet, but that's your thing at the moment. And so you wrote to the rights, didn't you?
Yeah, I think it's not just, I fear it's not going to be just of the moment either. You know, this is just ongoing, and it connects to every level of politics that we see there. It cannot not do that. You know, it has to, because that's how our lives are shaped, and we're in connection. You know, we're in connection with, you know, if we think about how our food is produced. In fact, there's a big UN summit coming up on, you know, the UN Food Summit, and that's going to look at how, you know, when you think about industrial farming, you think about all the agribusiness that is, you know, kind of promoting genetically modified seed, for example, and really pushing for, you know, that kind of process to be in place all over the world. But really, who are the communities that it's suiting, and, you know, what are the economic you know, implications of that? And I think we have to ask those questions, particularly now. You know, this sort of idea of the monocrop. You know, and in a lot of ways, it's people's habitats. You know, it's that idea of habitat, and that habitat could be for a butterfly or an insect, a family. It's, you know, it occurs in lots of sort of different ways, in little ripples. If we think of that idea of the ripple, you know, sort of rippling out the concentric circle of effect.
So you wrote to Article 17. Do you want to have a read of that?
Yeah, sure. Shall I go?
Why not?
Read that for everybody. See how it looks from here? Great. Yeah, so Article 17 was the right to own property alone, as well as in association with others, and also the idea that no one should be arbitrarily deprived of his property, as it's stated in the Declaration. which, you know, that idea of property and whether we can just claim a piece of land, and thinking about what the, you know, kind of the way the sort of settler nation state and the global politics that that has enacted, and its impact on the ecologies, you know, on global ecologies around the world. And that's kind of really what was sort of holding me in this space. And also sort of thinking about, you know, kind of how a home is not necessarily property. So I'll read the poem. And that this is an article, an object of property, aka her body, is where I've arrived, pushing into the morning, thankful for chitter-chatter, birds in conversation, the graceful catharsis of trees. And when I walk through swathes of green, churning that soothes thoughts of how to write this end of, will it ever end? Spectacle economy, an academic term, as in what they do, they, as in governments, corporations, whose arms are our arms, digits sweeping screens, checking prices, whose mouths are our mouths to feed, whose mouths are genocidal loggers, busy crunching lichen, vomiting monkeys. These entities that are, linguistically speaking, also bodies, who hide and seek while we look elsewhere, who make sorcery when our eyes are barely averted or poked out. And still there are men who pay to enter children, their chubby little torsos and dimpled knees, as if purchase makes property. And it's essential to keep looking up at feathery white clouds, white stucco above shops, into white space as it sticks and burns like fingers stuck to an ice cube tray in a raided fridge, groping for lollies. Remembering how this cartography of pacing, this walking away, is illuminated under an industrial chimney, its plumes seeping into sky that is also owned. A sky is also occupied air, where geese fly, wings lifting them away from the gavage of industrial liver farming. Gavage rhymes with. And these creatures, human, like to eat this expensive and desirable stuff. And where are the graveyards, headstones, shorelines, riverbeds, canyons, creeks, fonts, doorways? Where are the unowned spaces, lived in or empty? Let the ladder ascend to a high plain, a meadow, loaned and contingent, where pigeons' wings purr, loud and sudden as engines.
Thank you. Jojo, I think probably, in our lifetime, we have seen new language come about around the environment. We've seen things like, poets in residence for ecological purposes. And, these are all quite new. And yet, at the same time, as Nnimmo says, the first drill went into the Delta region in 1956, I think he said. So we've known this has been coming for a very, very long time, and only recently have we coined or started using the idea of ecocide. Can you just talk a bit about that word and why you've become a warrior for it?
Absolutely. It is a relatively new word, and in fact the dates that Nnimmo was referring to predate the first use of the word ecocide, which was back in 1970 to refer to the damage that Agent Orange caused in Vietnam. It was first used on the international stage in 1972 by Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme, who implied that actually it should be dealt with at the international level. But in terms of a kind of more general understanding, public understanding of that word, there's a huge credit due here to my dear departed friend and colleague, Polly Higgins, who in the early 2000s had a kind of epiphany moment where she asked herself, how can we actually create a legal duty of care for the earth? And she ended up looking at the criminal law side of things. She was a barrister herself, and she was just on the verge of a very lucrative career when she started investigating this. And she began with the concept of rights of nature, and of course there is now quite a global movement around that, around potentially giving nature personhood. She started there, and she was actually involved in the discussions around what became the earth rights in the Ecuadorian constitution, for example, and the Declaration of Rights of Mother Earth as a concept. But what she realized is that what protects those rights is actually criminal law. I mean, in a very basic way, our basic human right is the right to life, but what protects that right to life is the fact that to take it is a crime. And that was how she ended up in this conceptual area, if you like, around where is the criminal law to protect nature. And what she discovered was that in the drafting process for the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of the International Criminal Court, there had originally been a clause which would have covered serious harm to nature, which never made it to the final cut, to the treaty that was signed in 1998. And she dedicated the rest of her life really to reinstating what she saw as the key missing crime. And one of the things she used to always ask was, can you imagine if the International Criminal Court that came into being in 2002 had covered ecocide, in other words, had covered serious damage and destruction of nature, what world might we be in now? And how can we look at that as a kind of spur to actually putting that crime effectively back into place where it should have been? And I think the thing that is really interesting about the word is that it does have a kind of internal momentum. I mean, etymologically, it was born in a similar way to the word genocide, with this mixture of sort of Greek and Latin influences. So ecocide literally, etymologically, means killing one's home. And of course, I mean, I suppose perhaps ever since, man went into space and took pictures of the planet, we have this understanding that was not previously there, that there is no other home that we have. The planet is our home. And we are in the process of killing it. And of course, everyone has this strong sense that nature is being damaged in so many different ways. And there's something about the word ecocide which sort of brings all of that together. This is all serious harm to nature. And of course, as soon as we understand that, there's actually almost an automatic moral response. That's wrong, that has to stop. And that in itself is very much helping with moving this movement forward in terms of the whole public understanding of needing to legislate for this.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating in a space that we've all been in, where we obviously have been doing a lot of talking, and where language is so important, and where the coining of language with poetry to make something clear, so you can sort of suddenly understand it. I mean, if you can't understand it through words, then often you can't understand it. You can't name it. So was the coining of the word and the kind of clarity that we are destroying our world, it is a crime, it is our home, we are burning our own home, we're destroying our own home, we're poisoning our own home. Is that finding of a word created an acceleration of action and emotional commitment? Is that what you feel? I
absolutely think that that's the case, actually. And it means that actually, this movement for which Stop Ecocide International, which I co-founded with Polly Higgins, our key drive at the moment is precisely to bring that concept and that word into as many different cultural contexts, as many different language contexts and geographical contexts as possible. Because what we see, and we now have communication teams in nearly 20 countries, what we see is that where those conversations are happening and that word is emerging, the politicians are also starting to pay attention. That's where they're then coming to us and saying, what is this ecocide concept? What can you tell us about it? And of course, this key milestone in this has been the emergence of the legal definition of ecocide, which of course Philippe Sands was very deeply involved in.
Right, so will that come to you, Philippe, then? this idea of making it a crime at the international criminal courts, and the kind of sudden emotional commitment. You know, when everybody says, you know, the Court of Human Rights, well, not everybody thinks hooray, but you know, many people give it a kind of gold mark and sort of go, yes, okay, well, we want that place to, you know, to think about horrific crimes against humanity. By putting the planet into that same place, have you found, Philippe, that the international communities and us as ordinary people have changed our relationship to the idea of prosecution of these crimes, like the ones that Nnimmo is talking about?
Well, firstly, Jude, thank you so much, and to all your colleagues at this wonderful festival. It's an amazing thing to be on a panel with a poet, with an architect, with an ecologist, with you. It's the importance of just bringing together all these different fields in a common direction, and you've done it extraordinarily well. I think in answering that question, you've got to go back, in a sense, as Jojo has done, to the 1940s. People forget that until 1945, there was no crime of genocide. There was no crimes against humanity. These are inventions, human inventions. They're words with powerful resonance, created by a very small group of individuals, mostly lawyers, but not only. You had Elif's remarkable lecture. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you, but I've read it. And she honours H.G. Wells, who of course was not a lawyer, but basically set the ball rolling in the 1930s with his ideas on human rights. And in 1945, one man in particular, Raphael Lemkin, invented the word genocide, and it has stuck. Words really matter. They open up the imagination. That word, more than any other in the human lexicon, sort of stands for real horror. But all of the crimes that were invented in 1945 dealt with the mistreatment of human beings. And the difference with this is that it's intended to fill a gap. I mean, we called it the fifth crime. I listened to Nnimmo's account. I'm not as familiar with him, of course, of the details, but I've worked on some of those cases. I know what's going on around the world. Many of the cases that I'm involved in deal with these horrors. And there are laws, it's true, but there are very few international laws, and there are none that criminalize ecological devastation on that scale or even on a lesser scale. And so the idea of ecocide is to fill a gap. And yes, it is resonating. I argued a case at the International Court of Justice in The Hague in 1995 on nuclear weapons and their consequences. And I was acting for a group of small island states from the Pacific. And it was they, these four countries, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Micronesia, Marshall Islands, who said, well, the use of nuclear weapons would have environmental effects, so the court must say something about that. And all the nuclear power states, Britain, led by Britain, France and the United States, and said, no, environment's got nothing to do with nuclear weapons. Don't do it, dear court, keep it out. But the court did. For the first time in its history, the court said, you know what, yes, the use of nuclear weapons would have impacts on the environment. And they declared that the protection of the environment for present and future generations was now part of the corpus of international law. So that has become the base. And our exercise, led by Jojo and with a dozen other colleagues, is intended to fill a gap. And the reaction to that gap has been really interesting. Very shortly after we came up with the definition, the Secretary General of the United Nations announced that he thought the statute of the International Criminal Court should be changed. And I think that fact signals this is going to happen. It's not a question of whether, it's a question of when. And it's about changing consciousness. You know, that we know, you know as well as anyone, Jude, changing the law does not stop indecent acts.
Yep.
We have crimes of murder, we have crimes of rape. It doesn't stop terrible things from happening, but it changes consciousness. And it says, this cannot be done. And over time, the hope is the law, along with poetry and film and culture and theatre and any number of other human activities transforms human consciousness, and that's really what this is about.
Okay, so could you put the lights up on the audience? Thank you. You've got a group of people, and actually it's not surprising in a festival of human rights that there's so many lawyers come to talk about what they do, but I do want to give a shout out for lawyers, and particularly at the moment when this term activist lawyer is being coined in such a kind of pernicious manner, as if to suggest that being a lawyer who cares about something and wants to make any change in the world is somehow a little bit dodgy. So we've had a lot of activist lawyers, hooray, and and I know from other parts of all of our work that it's one thing to sort of coin an idea, it's another thing to do the forensic detail and dogged committee meetings and the boring, endless Sunday morning phone calls where you're changing a document, to get stuff through. It's not simple, and it's years of patience. So I just want to applaud the work. Like editing a poem, actually. I mean,
I was nodding.
Starts being fun, ends up being a slog.
colons
So, audience, let's see what you would like to ask or say. Any questions or thoughts from the audience about this? It's a huge subject, I know. Somebody there, and somebody there. Yeah. I'll take 3 questions in one go, and then we can. Yeah.
Yes, not a lawyer, but still got a question. Mine was kind of around, I wondered if there was any examples of this kind of having success of taking companies or governments to court. And I also wondered, what's the possibility of this empowering citizens as well to take those companies to court and being able to use Ecocide as something that they can really use to make their case?
So governments taking companies to court and individuals being able to sort of almost like make citizen arrests, as it were.
Yeah, so how can this empower, just everyday people as well?
Okay, what are the examples of that? I'll come back to that. There's somebody here, and then there's somebody over there. Yeah.
Might be along similar lines, but I suppose I just wonder what initiatives are being taken to bring this more into the public sphere, make it more accessible. I think art being one way, but I just wonder to know how is this being pushed out into the masses rather than the captive audience of people who have come along to an environmental day.
Okay, fine. And somebody here? You were going to ask the same question. Okay. Anybody want one more question before we? Yes.
I think going back to the person that spoke on the screen, if it's taking so long for any judicial action, how can that be shortened and more direct? Because whatever you do, if it's going to take 30 years, it's not in my lifetime anymore, it's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, so Philippe, let's just come to you first of all on the issue of, are companies now having to stand trial, and can you almost like as an individual citizen call attention to something and force people to stand trial for acts of ecocide?
I mean, it's a big question. The focus that we've put on is on getting the statute of the International Criminal Court amended to include a 5th crime, ecocide. And the reason we've focused on that path is it's a very simple way to then causing more than 100 countries to have to change their domestic law. Whereas the alternative is to deal with each country individually. So I think, as Nnimmo said, we want global solidarity, and this is a way of doing that. Once you go into the statute of the International Criminal Court, the focus is not on governments or corporations or NGOs or anyone else, it's on individuals. And think back to the famous Nuremberg trial. You all know those images of 22 men sitting in the dock. They were not there as government representatives or corporate representatives, some of them. They were all individuals who had positions in government or positions working for as chief executives of corporations. And the idea is, and I know this from my own work, I've mentioned publicly before that when I've done advices on, for example, the tobacco industry, of course the focus is on companies. that engage in these kinds of activities, including Nnimmo has mentioned oil companies and other companies that deal in hazardous waste and so on and so forth. But the bottom line is, in my view, individuals don't cause corporations don't cause ecological damage. Individuals cause ecological damage because individuals run corporations. Just as back in 1945, Hersch Lauterpacht, who I wrote about in my book East-West Street, said states don't commit crimes against humanity, individuals commit crimes against humanity. And to my mind, it's much more effective as a deterrent to focus on individuals, not governments, not corporations. That's what concentrates the mind. And it was in relation to tobacco, for example, the idea that a chief executive or chief operating officer or a director or even a shareholder of a tobacco company might incur criminal liability for being engaged in a corporation that caused harm on so massive a scale is the fact that concentrates the minds. So I'm firmly in favour of focusing on the individuals.
Okay, but we're a long way, aren't we, still from some of this? Because Southeast Water, just to name them, have dumped sewage into the Kent Sea, an estuary, for 6 years. And they've been fined, I think, £6 million, which is quite a lot, but not one person has stood trial. And obviously, people knowingly did it. They knew they were doing it.
I mean, it's peanuts. 6 million for Southeastern is just absolute peanuts. It's not a deterrent. They couldn't care less.
No, because
the moment you tell the director of a company that they risk spending time in prison, it totally changes. So I'm very much in favour of that, and that is slow, but it is beginning to come onto the agenda.
So, Jojo, I mean, that idea that it's about individuals, I think the public would enjoy that. Do you know what I mean? Actually, that sounds a bit kind of cheap, but I think that would help us all to get behind it, because you'd go, okay, we're expected to be accountable if we don't pay our tax, if we don't pay our TV licence. I mean, the number of letters you get if you don't pay your TV licence, including we're coming to get you. Personal experience. But which I just forgot. But the thing is that at the moment, by always having this idea of faceless and, and this, even the word, corporations. So Philippe says you're heading that way. How far away? I was away.
I think this is absolutely key, in fact, that individual responsibility aspect as a deterrent. And I will come back to the timescale, but it's particularly important in the corporate context, because, I'm absolutely sure there is no such thing as an average genocidal maniac, but what I can pretty much guarantee is that a genocidal maniac is not so concerned about their PR as a corporate decision maker. And so ecocide as a crime actually has a potentially particularly forcible sort of presence as a deterrent, because, as a CEO or as a key decision maker in a corporate context, it is a disaster for your business, for the reputation of your business, for your stock value, your share price, your investor confidence, your insurability, all of those things, if you're criminal. So actually there's a huge potential for deterrence here, which is really, really important, and I think very key for the public to understand, actually. The other aspect of that is that with civil litigation, of course, you're talking about a person or a community against directly the corporation. With a criminal law, you're not looking at that. Obviously, this is a very facile way to describe it, but let's say, ecocide goes into international law, it goes into domestic law. In theory, at least, one could tap a policeman on the shoulder and say, I'd like to report an ecocide. It's not, you don't then have to do that, that dynamic, that happens in the courts. That's the state that has to go and do that. So it's a very different prospect. And in terms of the time scale, we estimate it could take 4 to 5 years to get to the stage where countries are beginning to ratify this crime at the ICC. The last time the Rome Statute was amended with a new crime was with the crime of aggression. It was under discussion for a long time, and it took 7 to 10 years for the amendment process. But we do believe that this particular moment in history, this particular political climate, and of course the literal, emergency of the literal climate that we're experiencing, are conspiring to very much bring this moment nearer to us. And already we're seeing countries getting interested in this, with a sort of, the beginnings of a snowball effect. We're already in communication with at least 15 member states of the ICC who are already talking about this at parliamentary or government level, and there are more behind closed doors, as Philippe knows. So, this is something that is definitely further ahead than most people realise. So we consider our job to actually be to get this conversation into as many networks and as many different publics as possible. We always urge our audiences to take account of the networks that they all have, because we all have networks, and to start using this word and to start spreading this concept.
And so if we, got this into the statute books as a crime and it was individualised, the point that you're making about, how long does it take, because you can spin these out, you can put obstructions in. I mean, obviously, rich individuals can make it very difficult as well. But would it be quicker to bring justice if it was an individual crime than if it was a corporate crime?
I'm not sure that I feel completely qualified to answer that, but I think that there's another aspect to this that we haven't quite touched on and that's actually incredibly important. And that is, it's actually really important that although we need this to happen fairly quickly because of the catastrophic potential of the situation that we're in, but at the same time, we don't want it to happen overnight. And one of the reasons for that is that this is what we're aiming to do in a way with this law, and Philippe touched on it very strongly with this idea of changing consciousness. What it has the potential to do is to create almost a kind of a new taboo. I mean, we all know you can't go to a government and say, oh, can I have a permit to kill 500 people for my new infrastructure project? I mean, it literally won't even cross your mind. I mean, not only is it criminal and it's illegal, it's bad and wrong, but it's so far out of what we consider acceptable that it just doesn't cross our minds. But we don't have that same sort of recoil from destroying nature at all. In fact, we go get a license to do it. Yeah. So, there's something about that, and that takes time. It takes time for governments to be able to put transition policies in place. It takes time for corporations to be able to see it as a kind of a compliance period and to get creative about moving in the right direction.
Right. So, Nnimmo, you're back, which is great. And we've been talking about changing the nature of ecocide to make sure the buck stops at individuals as well as companies, but to have that individual accountability and responsibility. And Jojo just made the very good point that if you went and said, I'm going to ensure that women will be unable to, cook fish because it'll be poisonous. I'm going to make sure, as part of my portfolio, that children will be dying early from poisonous water. A part of my job will be to ensure that a whole swathe, millions of people in Nigeria won't be able to rely on good air. That's going to be part of my job, by the way. Then, people wouldn't give the person the job and they wouldn't give the company the contract. Why has the government, not just Nigeria, but in other places as well, what is it that stops the people being able to insist that the governments give them their rights against these companies? It sounds like a naive question. I mean, if the answer is just money, I suppose it is. But Nigeria is a proud democracy most of the time. And at the same time, it has this blot, a huge blot, which is not just of the kind of the West's making, is it? It's a collusion that's happened for a long time. Does Nigeria, in terms of its people, feel they can change the attitude of the government?
Maybe frozen.
For a moment, I thought he didn't like the question, but I think he's frozen. Hi, Nnimmo, can you hear me? No, I think it's...
Well, that's a complex question. I'm hearing you. I don't know why you're not.
It freezes sometimes.
Oh, he can hear us.
Okay, yeah, the network, yeah. Okay, I'll be very quick. I think this is a general problem, getting politicians to think, to act in the interest of the people once they've gotten the votes. And so it's a continuous struggle to keep changing them until we have people. This is why the struggle for environmental justice is also a political struggle.
Yeah.
Because you can't separate this, you can't separate the environmental struggle from the kind of political and socio-economic realities that we have. In particular in Nigeria, the problem we have is that the governments and the corporations are working together in joint ventures. So when you attack the community, you are attacking the government. When you attack the corporation, you are equally pointing your fingers at the government, and they're totally in bed, and they don't want to, they protect themselves. And this is why the problem has persisted. But I so much like the idea about ecocide aiming at the individual, because if we change corporate, remove directors from the shield, from hiding behind corporate shields, that would clearly, as Professor Sand said, change the attitude of those people who are directing this kind of harmful activities going on around the world.
Okay, so if you had something you would like us to do, Jojo, what is it that we could go out of this room with and do?
Well, we actually have a whole menu of things you can do if you go look at our website, which is stopecocide.earth, in case anybody wants to go and look it up. But the primary thing is something I already touched on, which is talk about it. It sounds very simple, but the more this word is heard, and in the more different contexts it becomes currency, the faster this is going to change. And we see that from our perspective very obviously. We can see that the political discussion arises where the conversations are happening. So talk about ecocide.
And Karen, I mean, I do believe that culture often leads the way in terms of getting people to think about it and sort of giving a permission space for people to talk about things without needing to have legal language, academic language, just have feelings.
I think feelings is, the key word that I would have brought into that, actually. So in a lot of ways, I think of poetry more as it's an activism, but it's an activism of the heart. How do we feel? And we might start, we might feel sort of guilty about having, there's whole poems on sort of getting one of those plastic coffee cup lids and going, oh God, But that's the thing about the individual and the corporation, because I was interested in that, but the idea that the individual within the corporation, within the corporate body, is responsible. But it's also important for us to think we need to hold those corporations, the larger body, to account, and that although we can do our individual things, if there is a mechanism via which we feel we can hold them to account, then I think that's really important. And just on a tiny little kind of thing on language, when you're sort of thinking about what to do today, I would say boycott Amazon and go for the Amazon. Okay. Let's have the Amazon, not Amazon.
Okay,
the Amazon. That's my incentive. Let's just do that, please.
I also think it's about different ways of truth-telling as well.
Yeah.
I feel that, poetry has such a place for truth that speaks directly to the heart. And, that kind of encaptures things in a way that doesn't feel so cut and dried. And law has a way of dealing with the truth in a different way. And they're both absolutely important. But I think that's, again, one of the beauties of this word, ecocide, is that it brings that kind of, it has that strength about it that, there are plenty of treaties that potentially would be really useful in terms of dealing with the environment, but they've got long and complicated names no one can remember. Yeah. And there's something about the word ecocide that does a sort of bridging quality, that it has a kind of visceral quality to it.
And actually law and poetry, like the sort of lay and its etymology is actually the line. Where do you draw the line? And poetry is all about that line as well. So there's a really nice affinity between the two. Yeah.
Well, it was Shelley who said, and I drew on this when I was thinking about how to construct the festival, the poets are the unofficial legislators of the world. And of course, those poets at that period, those romantic poets, were very, very concerned to draw attention to the beauty of the environment and write for and with people who had little literacy in order to be able to give them back the landscape. They were radicals in their time. Philippe, can I just come back to you? The idea of us as activists, us making changes happen. We're in a situation where we're NIMBYism, and there's a lot of negative words being poured to make it down to make us feel uncourageous or othered, as Tim Schmidt said this morning. But do you feel that the SDG goals, they're not very they're not very good off the tongue, are they? But the SDG goals and the kind of idea of the travelling forward of ecocide, is it producing for COP26 something that is building an uncontestable urgency, with or without your political colours of right or left? Are politicians going to have to move down this road now together?
Well, I mean, they should move down, but I mean, I'm pretty sceptical about what's going to come out of COP26. I mean, and I'm not making a party political point, but when you've got a government that is simultaneously urging everyone to go much further, including other countries, on climate change goals and reducing emissions and so on and so forth, and simultaneously seeking to authorise a new coal mine in Cumbria, you've got a problem. I mean, we are just going to have to be extremely brutal about this. And this is not just about governments, it's about individuals. And in drafting the ecocide definition, I was acutely conscious of our individual responsibilities. I do cases around the world, for example, in relation to maritime boundaries. States are often have disputes. Is my boundary here? Is it there? And many of these boundaries are in the sea. And I'm involved in quite a few of these cases in various parts of the world. But behind these cases, and Nnimmo will be very aware of this in Nigeria, because Nigeria and Cameroon had one of these cases some years ago. Behind all of these cases, inevitably, are issues about access to resources. And so I'm now asking myself the question, by being an independent lawyer, a university academic, who, on the face of it's doing a decent thing, helping governments resolve their disputes, am I actually a criminal? Am I facilitating the taking of oil out of the ground? And I don't ask that question in jest. I think at the end of the day, each of us have responsibilities, and we have to, each of us, look much longer and harder as to what we are doing. And then we really can haul our governments to account. I think Nnimmo said it very powerfully. The evidence is now overwhelming. I mean, a few days ago, I read one news piece which described for the first time, and this is for a poet rather than for a lawyer, the sound of rain falling on a Greenland mountain. It had never before been recorded. This had never happened before, as far as we know. Now, something is happening, something dramatic is happening. And I think governments, corporations, NGOs, individuals, and even lawyers must be activists. I'm proud now to be an activist lawyer, and I'm proud to be criticised for not going far enough by my kids, by younger generations, of leaving behind a big bloody mess, and over the last 30 years not having done enough. Yeah. So we must do more. I'm sceptical, but there is a movement. There's something happening, plainly.
Nnimmo, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us, Philippe. Thank you for being here, Karen. Thank you for being here, Jojo. And thank you for being here, audience. You're about to go off to your next sessions, which is either Stop Screwing Up Our Future, Shoulder to Shoulder, or The Future of Cultural Practice. And then join us back at 5:15 with Andy Burnham and two young climate activists to talk about what a human rights city could look like. Thank you.